The first of the speakers is Barbara Herr Harthorn, who is one of, I have to say, it was so excited, like when I looked at the agenda for today, it's like lots of my favorite people in the whole world, and Barbara is one of them. She's a professor at UC Santa Barbara and is part of a big interdisciplinary center that's joint between UC Santa Barbara, UCLA, Bodega Marine Laboratory, a bunch of other institutions, UTEP in El Paso, that's brought together a wide range of researchers looking at the environmental implications of nanotechnology. And Barbara has been sort of our philosopher guide, rock, steering us through these waters, and a really wonderful social science collaborator for all of us. And again, you can read about her whole bio here, but she's amazing. Here she is.
Okay, no pressure, just have to be amazing. I'm going to read because if I don't read, it will not be 10 minutes, it will be 30 minutes because I love to embellish. So Tim asked me to talk today about an area of research in the risk perception and communication fields known as intuitive toxicology. And as the name sounds, this refers to the processes by which we as human beings and as members of particular social and cultural groups intuitively try to make sense of risk and hazard, with a preference for using our own direct sensory apparatus to see, smell, and taste. Regarding toxics, taste and smell are particularly known as the chemical senses. For example, the smell of rotting food alerts us to potentially dangerous food spoilage, and the taste of contaminated water will similarly alarm us. But we draw on other senses as well. The sight of billowing clouds of smoke can alert us to oncoming toxic exposures. We have highly developed senses, especially we women, yes, scientific evidence, and they can provide us with nuanced analysis, for example, of wine's diverse tastes. I recommend this article. It's an NPR article if you want to pursue that idea further and the gender differences in those capabilities. However, many chemicals, both natural and synthetic, overwhelm our ability to rely on our senses for safety. An example from my own research, agricultural farm workers have concerns about exposure to agricultural chemicals, and in spite of stringent worker safety regulations in California, they're frequently exposed. Farm worker, in fact, the best, arguably the best in the country, nonetheless, daily exposures take place. Farm workers rely on intuitive tox, sight and smell in particular, to protect themselves. For example, they smell agricultural chemicals during direct applications, and they see when the helicopters fly over spraying the fields. However, there's a large body of research that shows that their main source of harm is lower dosage chronic exposures. That cumulative risk assessment that Bernie was talking about earlier, to multiple chemicals, fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, and the main exposure pathway is not from breathing, but rather through their skin. Toxicology came about as a field to provide systematic scientific evidence about chemical hazards and exposure risk, and yet paradoxically, social scientists have noted that the advancement of the science of toxicology, while absolutely vital, has not reduced everyday people's concerns about toxic chemical exposures. In fact, such concerns have escalated greatly. Publics are concerned about the production, use, transportation, and disposal of chemicals. Intuitive toxicology came about as a term and approach to compare scientific expert assessments and lay public risk perceptions about toxic chemicals. So how do lay publics and toxicologists' judgments differ? And most of this work is based on work in the US, I should say. The intuitive toxicology literature has compared US and Canadian publics and toxicologists' views on toxic risks. And so they've done this looking at these four main, there, sorry. these four main aspects of intuitive toxicology, and I'll go through each of those just briefly. So there are some similarities. So this column here is the toxicologist, and this is the public. So this second row here, trust in animal and bacteria studies as proxies for humans. One of the surprising findings out of that body of literature is that toxicologists share public's low confidence in animal studies to serve as good guidance for hazard in humans. They were very surprised at that. On the other hand, differences abound here. So toxicologists were found to think that dose does make the poison, and so they're showing high dose sensitivity in thinking about toxic exposures. Publics, on the other hand, have consistently shown little or no sensitivity to dose. And so that means that they tend to believe that if a toxin is dangerous, if something is a carcinogen, then it's bad at any level of exposure. And so that's a profound difference, except for pharma. So pharmaceuticals, which obviously have many toxic, potentially toxic chemicals in them, there's much more dose sensitivity among publics for that. And so similarly down here, toxicologists have lower risk perception about chemicals, publics much higher. Toxicologists believe that cost-benefit analysis should be done in what you should do about those risk and hazard, and whereas publics think that risk-free options should be pursued regardless of cost. So very different approaches to what to do about them. And why these views differ has been the topic of a great deal of research. Experts tend to base their assessments, their narrow and relatively deep risk assessments, on single source, single instance exposures of relatively pure chemicals in highly controlled experimental settings. We publics tend to take many more variables into account in our judgments. For example, all of these factors have been found in risk perception studies to drive amplification of risk perception among public. And so I'm not going to read all of these, but for example, when people are involuntarily exposed, so think about radiation from Fukushima, versus an X-ray you receive at the clinic, that will drive chemicals that are invisible will drive risk perception, hazards that are poorly understood, and all these other variables make lay people less willing to accept the risks. And I've picked up, working in this interdisciplinary field, I've picked up some of the handy little sayings that toxicologists and ecologists have. So the one that I would say regarding unfamiliarity novel, the frame that is used, which is familiarity breeds consent, I have found very useful. The other ecologist's idea around dose, the idea that the solution to pollution is dilution, capture some of these ideas fairly well. So anthropologists and sociologists have analyzed these responses and argue that it's precisely because we cannot rely on our own senses to literally make sense of toxic risks that our concerns amplify. Having to rely on expert interpretations, esoteric modeling systems, and other complex technologies, think a Geiger counter with an expert interpreting it, means we all have to trust those other intervening judges of risk and safety. Increasingly, trust is harder to come by, and government and industry have often failed to live up to the needs for responsible governance of science and technology to gain the public's trust. So I'm just going to, in my remaining couple minutes, I'm going to show you a couple examples from the work on nanotechnology that we've done, but first just a brief slide to explain that nanotechnologies are a whole suite of new kinds of materials that have many new and exciting characteristics, but also have had many unknowns in terms of their risk characterization. In this slide, now that you have seen the factors that drive risk perception, you can see here that this is a slide from an article that is arguing, it's depicting a young child with a lot of bare skin, so a lot of dermal exposure. It is worrying about unbound nanosilver particles that could go through, penetrate the dermal barriers, and with unknown scientific effects. We know that all of those characteristics amplify concern, and in fact, a lot of people have taken that up. I think I'm going to, because I'm just about out of time, I won't present the data slide here, but essentially we've done, this is survey work based on qualitative work where we interview people to get their mental models about toxins in the environment, and then we model questions, and over 50% on these first 6 questions disagree, and those are what we would call lay toxicology sets of ideas and constructs. Similarly, we have found food, the idea of nanotechnologies in food. This was a survey done in 2007, and you can see that the vast majority of respondents, all but 7, either said they need more information or that they would not accept nano in food. We also found food unacceptable to many people. In fact, in our survey work where we model, this is from qualitative deliberative work, and I won't read it to you, but in survey work we also found that even if we model all beneficial factors contributing, food was unacceptable to large national representative surveys. That food in particular is seen as not conveying benefits, as not adding new needed qualities, and in fact tampering with nature and its connections to food commodification and corporate control. Perfectly acceptable products already exist, so why do this? And so on. We've also looked at the NGO world and its response to nanotechnology. So this is a study of 264 social movement organizations, 107 of which are nano-engaged as opposed to just endorsing other groups. And they have primarily focused on consumer safety and environmental protection issues. But again, their actions have almost entirely been focused on lack of regulatory oversight and lack of toxicological research. So that is where they are pushing in that framework Tim gave you for how citizen action might take place. And mostly none of the public work that we've done focuses on particular engineered nanomaterials. It's really operating at a level of new emerging technologies. And just one last slide to show that experts in this field also disagree. So the point here is that experts are not immune from intuitive toxicology kinds of ideas. We found gender differences. The colored lines are nanoscience and engineer folks, the people actually characterizing the materials, the nanotoxicologists in red, and the nanoregulators in green, showing different levels of risk sensitivity, and also differentiating among products, not necessarily on the basis of their toxicologic properties, but for example, nanoremediation is seen as a more beneficial product, and regardless of what the nanomaterial used. So lay intuitive tox is definitely based on senses, but also on values and ideas about pollution, purity, trust, and a host of other variables. Experts also have biases that take and play in the way they approach the risk characterization. Risk communication, which we don't have time to talk about, is the best available method for mediating these profound differences between publics and experts. And as I think we've already seen today, this really does require a multidisciplinary approach. We all just have pieces of the composite needed to solve this. So thank you.